Thought Gary was going to start preaching my lesson there for just a moment. Good to see each one of you here this morning. We appreciate your presence, especially those of you who are visiting with us. We are glad that you're here. We're encouraged by your presence to be with us this morning, and invite you back at any opportunity you have to be with us. You're never going to guess what I'm going to preach on this morning. Maybe. But we looked at last week to begin conversion. And the overall kind of generality of what conversion is, but then also specific of what conversion is. And we want to continue the same thought of conversion but looking at specific cases in the book of Acts. This morning, we're going to begin there in Acts chapter 8 of our text that we read of the Ethiopian eunuch. Today, as we relate many modern days or cases of conversion, conversion in a lot of people's minds is just that there's a warm, fuzzy feeling that comes over me, and I know I am saved. Or as baptism itself is just used as a symbol of being saved. But conversion in the book of Acts and the New Testament involves a lot more than all of those. The two classes of conversion which we can choose from, that of modern day cases or of biblical cases of conversion. Bible cases of conversion are under divine supervision twice, when done and when written. The rule and example simplify the matters. While the book of Acts has given us examples of those who were converted to Christ. The Ethiopian eunuch there in Acts chapter 8, let's look at the man. The man to be converted. He was a treasurer of Queen Candace. He was a man of great authority. Candace was a title rather than a name. It was a title that was used by a number of the Ethiopian queens, applied to the reigning queen mother. Not being a proper name, but that of a dynasty of Ethiopian queens. Verse 27 of our text there describes this man of a position of great authority, of a great trust that was placed in him. The eunuchs were often used in positions of high authority. The Ethiopian king was thought to be a child of the sun god that they worshipped. And they were afraid for him to govern, to rule, because they thought it was kind of beyond him. They thought that he was more holy than that. So the exercise of rule came down to the queen. This man, either a Jew or a proselyte, he went to Jerusalem for a specific purpose. He went to worship. What we do know about this man, I do believe, that is he was a God-fearing man. Possibly a Gentile that was half converted to Judaism. As a eunuch, though, he could never have belonged to the Old Testament people of God, according to Deuteronomy chapter 23 and verse 11. However, he could, and other eunuchs said he wasn't the only one, they could receive the gospel and become part of the people of God. This man traveled a great deal, a long way. It is thought of where he traveled, it was Ethiopia. Thought to be a city that was named Nubia, which was just south of Egypt. Would have been approximately about 200 miles. Ethiopia, as we know today, is a little further. Could have been, if we look at Ethiopia today, it's possibly in the range of about 1,000 miles. But the distance isn't important. He went to Jerusalem for a specific purpose. He did so how? In his chariot. The Ethiopian eunuch represents many people today who are religious, who read the scriptures and seek the truth, but yet do not have a saving faith. They are sincere, but they are lost. They need someone to show them the way to Jesus. The lesson for us today in this Ethiopian eunuch, the lesson for us, what do we put before worship? Whether pleasure, whether business, or anything, what do we put before worship? This Ethiopian eunuch, worship was important to him. In his chariot, he traveled that distance in a chariot that was more than likely drawn, pulled by oxen and not horses. But he thought it important for him to go to worship. The preacher, Philip, the evangelist, and notice in the text here that the angel spoke to who? Spoke to Philip. The language that is used here is reminiscent of narratives of Elijah and Elisha. Philip was willing to leave Samaria as God told him to and instructed him for one lost soul. Now the angel could have very well told the eunuch, this is what you need to do to be saved. But the commission was given to men, not to angels. It was men that were to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. The angel he went to God told Philip, not the sinner, not the eunuch. That was the command given, the command given and how God directed their travel. God told you, Philip, you leave Samaria, you go down to this road that is between Jerusalem and Gaza, and you'll find this man. I don't believe there was any hesitation in Philip's part either to do. When he arrived, the Holy Spirit spoke to him, not the sinner, not the eunuch. Note again that he spoke to Philip. The angel angels didn't speak to Cornelius and tell him, this is what you need to do to be saved. He didn't speak to Paul and say, this is what you need to do to be saved. But he told them that they were going to be taught, they were going to be of what they need to do to be saved. These men would come to them and preach and teach to them. This is the design of God. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 21. It is by preaching the gospel, God says, to save men. This is what Philip was going to do to this man, with this man. As the eunuch was reading these scriptures, Isaiah chapter 53, specifically what is quoted here is verses 7 and 8. But he was reading Isaiah, and he was reading aloud something that was common in that time, that they would read aloud. Philip heard him, recognized what he was reading. We usually find people, we read aloud today, don't we, when traveling or whatever. There are times that I have to read aloud. Whatever I'm reading, I have to read because that helps me understand it better. Because I read it and I hear it as well. So it helps me understand it better. But notice he was reading aloud. When people read aloud, what do they read? The Bible? Or some other book? Philip came to him. And note his manner of introducing himself there in verse 30. There were no formalities. Philip was told to join him in his chariot. And Philip asked him, "Do you understand what you're reading?" Now, we today might take offense to a question like that. Of course I understand, get a little defense. Of course I understand what I'm reading. But the eunuch's answer, and possibly that they're of hearing this eunuch read and seeing him, possibly that Philip could tell he was a little troubled by what he was reading. He didn't understand. So he asked the question, "Do you understand what you're reading?" Then the eunuch's request there in verse 31. How can I? How can I understand unless someone helps me to understand? As Philip explained these passages, the eunuch began to understand. His mind then was open to the truth. And I think that is inherent in the request that he makes. How can I? It is not enough for the sinner to desire salvation. He must understand God's plan of salvation. It is the heart that understands. It is the heart that understands the word that eventually, Matthew 13 and verse 23, that eventually bears fruit. So his question there, verse 32 and 34. Before coming to Christ, the Jews did understand that this was a messianic passage of Isaiah 53. Later, some interpreted it as the suffering servant here is referring to the prophet or others of the people of Israel. But Philip shows him that this prophecy is about Jesus. And he goes back to the Lord's own teaching here. He goes back to the teaching that is recorded for us in Mark chapter 10. One place anyway, that he had come to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. Mark 10 and verse 45. No unbelieving Jew could answer his question. None could answer his question than without revelation from Christ. Philip preached Jesus how? How did he preach Jesus? If I talk of someone, a preacher of someone, what do I incorporate things about him. I tell of his maybe his family, his ancestry, some incidents in his life, and let's say some last sayings and his death. To preach Jesus means to preach his ancestry, his birth, his baptism, his temptation, his miracles, his betrayal, trial, death, his burial, his resurrection, his last charge, and his commission and his ascension. That's what it means to preach Jesus. Why not preach Christ? Let's leave out baptism. What does that do? Well, if we leave out baptism, we have to leave out the teachings of Matthew chapter 3. And at the end, Matthew 28, verse 19. We have to leave out both ends of the story. Now, how can we do that? Is only the middle part of the story important? The whole teaching of Jesus. It means to preaching Jesus, of everything about him. And upon preaching Jesus, what did the eunuch do? Well, it's working periodically, I think. So, what did the eunuch do? He asked the question, what hinders? How did he know? He knew from the preaching of Jesus. He knew from Philip. And verse 37, it gives his confession. And understand that there's a debate as whether verse 37 is in the original manuscripts or not. That's not the point. We don't want to debate that at all here. Whether it is or is not is I don't think is the part that we need to see. But what important to see is that it reflects the Christian's practice of baptism on his confession. He believed. And his response to the preaching of Philip was, what hinders me? What hinders so many to be baptized today? What hinders so many to turning their life over to God today? This man, the eunuch, he had everything that he wanted. He was the treasurer of a nation. And by all accounts, he was probably a very happy man. And happy in what he was doing. But yet he recognized from the preaching of Philip that something was missing. What hinders me? What hinders me from being baptized? What hinders you if you are not a child of God? What's hindering you from obeying the gospel of Jesus Christ? Verse 37 of Acts chapter 8 here gives us his confession, which is required upon our obedience to the truth. In Romans chapter 10, at verses 9 and 10, Paul writes there, because if thou shalt confess with thy mouth Jesus as Lord, and shalt believe in thy heart that God raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. For with the heart man believeth unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. So Paul explains here that confession is necessary for salvation. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 32, he says, therefore everyone will acknowledge me before others, I will also acknowledge him before my Father, or confess him. But whoever denies me before others, I will also deny him before my Father in heaven. So Jesus emphasizes a confession there as well. In 1 John chapter 4 and verse 15, John records, whosoever shall confess that Jesus is the Son of God, God abideth in him, and he in God. See, notice what he says there. Whoever shall confess Jesus is the Son of God. So in order for God to abide in him and he in God, one must confess that Jesus is the Son of God. How is that done? Well, Paul tells us how with the mouth, confession is made unto salvation. It's not a feeling. It's not a feeling that comes over us that we can just be silent on. But a confession with the mouth was made unto salvation. One of the debates within the religious world today is concerning baptism. This man to be converted, this Ethiopian eunuch, how was his baptism performed? Verses 38 and 39 give us that. Give us that method of baptism. But in the text there in Acts chapter 8, Jesus, or God, when he's talking to Philip, says, you go down to this road that's between Jerusalem and Gaza, and a parenthetical statement that says this is desert. Now one might think, well, how is one going to be baptized in the desert? This, in verse 36, here is this road. Gaza is a valley. There's a valley with running water in it. Philip was told to go to this road that goes from Jerusalem to Gaza. Which was one of five formerly cities of Philistines. The city itself was destroyed in 93 BC and then rebuilt about 36 years later. The site of Gaza was then built nearer to the sea. So which is desert then could refer to the road itself or the site of the older city. But nevertheless, we do know from these two verses that this road that he met this eunuch on had some water somewhere along this road because Philip baptized him. Philip apparently there put a challenge there to this eunuch. And he asked then Philip to baptize him. In Matthew chapter 14 and verse 13, it says, now when Jesus heard it, he withdrew from thence in a boat to a desert place apart. And when the multitudes thereof, they followed him on foot from the cities. The desert is just kind of a name for a remote place. This man was baptized into Christ. The method that is described to us of how baptism is performed here is given to us in Acts chapter 8. We hear a lot of debate of sprinkling, of pouring water and used for baptism. Now, if we take the number of miles, we'll just say 200 miles that this eunuch traveled. That area of the country is a lot of desert and remote places. And you've probably heard this argument before, but would he have traveled with no water? Probably not. So why did Philip just not pour or sprinkle a little water on him and call it baptism? But what it does tell us, verse 36, as they were traveling down the road, they came to some water. The eunuch said, "Look, there's water. What would keep me from being baptized?" Verse 38 says that both Philip and the eunuch went down into the water, and they baptized him. And when they came up out of the water, so if baptism is not immersion, then anywhere on the road, Philip could have sprinkled a little water, poured a little water on this man, and called it baptism. The eunuch, I believe, would recognize this as well. Because it says, look, here is water. Not here, I've got some water, but here is water. Verse 39, then here. He rejoiced. After being baptized into Christ, he rejoiced. No man ever rejoiced over his sins forgiven before baptism under the Great Commission there that Jesus gave. This man rejoiced, went on his way rejoicing. We don't know what became of the eunuch. And tradition and other writings say that he preached the gospel to his own people. Whether he did or not, we're not told. But I think that we can conclude logically and say that he probably did, because that was part of his rejoicing. He wanted others to feel, to do what he did. He rejoiced at his baptism. Suppose we meet him, the eunuch, on the road or in his own country. I'm going to ask him, why? Why are you rejoicing? What are you so happy about? Well, he very well could have said, I am tired. It's been a long journey. I'm glad I am home. What about your baptism? When you were baptized into Christ, what did you do? How did you feel? Were you rejoicing? Others were rejoicing with you, weren't they? The angels in heaven were rejoicing, weren't they? And what have you done subsequently since that time? You've taught others, haven't you? You talked to others about the gospel, about your conversion to Christ. Would he tell about the angel? Would he tell about the Spirit, the Holy Spirit? Now imagine, if you will, that this eunuch, after being baptized into Christ, and he went on his way rejoicing. And the change of his whole demeanor that came over him. And wanting to tell people about Jesus Christ. Let's suppose then he makes excuses, or we make excuses. I don't know just what my relatives would say. I've heard of stories. I've heard of fake stories, but of this as well. But I have heard of real stories. One in particular that I can think of is told to me by Brother Paul Stewart, who lived in West Virginia, of a 14-year-old girl that was taught the gospel. This when he was much younger himself. She was taught the gospel. And she was told by her parents, if you obey the gospel, if you are baptized, we are kicking you out of the house. And you're not our daughter. She obeyed the gospel. And they kicked her out of the house. She didn't make excuses. She didn't worry too much about what her mother and father said. She saw the importance of being a child of God. She didn't make excuses. Well, what are my mom and dad going to think? Suppose we make excuses about our job. Suppose this eunuch had said, well, I went to Jerusalem this year, and I have to go back. I'm going to go back next year for the same thing. Maybe I'll wait till then to be baptized. No. What does our text say? He wanted to be baptized right then and there. He saw the urgency of needing Christ. He didn't make excuses. Well, Philip, why don't you come down to Ethiopia with me and you teach my family, and if they obey, I will. No, he was concerned about his salvation. He was concerned about his soul. And he obeyed at the preaching of Jesus by Philip. Preaching Jesus changes one. Changes one's whole mindset. And that includes all of Jesus, his ancestry, his birth, his baptism, his temptation, his miracles, all of that. And it changes a man. It changes the mind to thinking that how could this man, Jesus, how could this one die for me? What can I do? And we'll never, ever repay the love that Christ showed for us. Never fully repay it. But what can I do to show my love to Jesus for what he did for me. And putting him on in baptism is a beginning. This man, this Ethiopian eunuch, rejoiced after obeying the gospel of Jesus Christ. So we have this question here. Does your conversion correspond to this? The rejoicing aspect I want to look at. Did you rejoice? Are you rejoicing? This man knew the importance and the urgency of putting Christ on in baptism. And that urgency and that importance is not any less today. Perhaps it's more urgent. Urgent in the sense that as of today, you and I are one step closer to Judgment Day than we were yesterday. And you know, I'm sure you've heard lessons on it time and time again of the uncertainty of life, the frailty of life. That's the urgency. We don't know what tomorrow holds. So if you're here this morning and not a child of God, let me ask you this question. Or as an erring child of God, and you've lost your zeal for Christ and preaching, and you've lost the aspect of rejoicing. But specifically to those who have not yet obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ, how long have you known the gospel? You know what you need to do. There's an old campaign from the Department of Transportation concerning seat belts. What's holding you back? What's holding you back from obeying the gospel? What's holding you back from rejoicing? How long have you known the gospel? Today, Paul says to the Corinthians, today is the day of salvation. Today, you need to see your need for the gospel, for your obedience to it. There's a saying that I never understood growing up, by my mom said it all the time, never understood it as a child. Tomorrow never comes. I understand now. So today is all we have. It's your need for your soul, for your salvation, is for you to obey the gospel of Jesus Christ today, right now. This moment before you, God has afforded to you to come to Him. I can't do it for you. No one here can do it for you. You must act upon your faith, and you alone. But what we are here for you to do for you, is to encourage you, to help you, to assist you in any way that we can. So why not come this morning? Put Christ on in baptism, or as an erring child of God, repent of sin in your life before it's too late. The singing of this song here, who at your door or who at the door is standing? Jesus is. He wants in your heart. Won't you let him while we stand and while we sing?